Okay, good morning. I think you can hear me. You pronounced my name perfectly. My last name is Bar-Shany. As mentioned, I come from Israel. I feel very much at home here. Same weather, same atmosphere. There are a lot of similarities between our countries. And what I will try to do today is to share some of the experiences of Israel and my personal experience being in technology and high tech for quite a few decades, and hopefully you'll take away some thoughts, some insights, some actions for your relevant system. Let me start by relating to the size of our countries. I was born in Israel. I spent all my life in Israel. I did go to public school in the United States. My wife was sitting here as American, and I worked many years within HP, because the startup I was working with in Israel, Indigo, was acquired by the HP. So I've experienced with very large corporations, large countries, and also the small Israel. And I actually love the innovation and the ability to do things within a small framework. And I'll tell you some of my insights and stories through my family life as well. This is a picture of one of my daughters, actually my fourth and smallest daughter, who just saw this big haystack somewhere in France and started pushing it. And for me, it's a symbol of how when you're very small, you can still be very stubborn and try to do some pretty interesting things. And I have the same kind of picture with my son. And actually, this slide I've been using for almost 20 years. This slide was taken like in 2004, and then I started my role as the general manager of HP Indigo, a relatively small business within HP. We were about $100-something million. And at that time, after sitting with the management team, we defined a vision to get to $1 billion. And most people thought we were quite crazy. And it was really important for us to try to convince the team and our shareholders that we can do it. And I used this image for many years, building the first $1 billion, and life is not linear. We had some fantastic years, we had some tough years, but I really remember the day when I came up before all the thousands of employees, and I showed this slide, and I said, that's it, we've reached $1 billion. And actually, once you reach it, you need to change the slides and say, building the next billion, getting to the $2 billion. And just to give a little bit of perspective, these pictures were taken almost 20 years ago. A couple of years ago, this is the same son and the same daughter in Tel Aviv. Again, very similar look and feel to Limassol here. And for me, a lot of the values of growth are around not necessarily the size and the endless resources, but actually the agility, the flexibility, the creativity, and the teamwork, the ability to do things faster than the very large companies and large economies. So again, what I'll do today, talk a little bit about Israel. I think some of you are aware, but still frame where we are, where we came from, and then talk a little bit about my experience and some of the, I would say, most important elements that I've taken away from my personal story. And I don't want to get too much into my personal story. On the one hand, it's very typical Israeli. You know, you go to high school, then you go to the army, you spend a few years in the army, you study. And when I started and joined the workforce in the mid-'80s, Israel was a relatively poor country with 500% inflation, with no foreign currency reserves, no high-tech whatsoever. And I've seen this transformation. I'll talk a lot about change in the industry, changes in the world, and the opportunities. And as I said before, I had the real amazing experience of being an Israeli startup called Indigo that was acquired by HP, managing this business for 16 years. I left about a year ago, and for the last year or something, I'm involved in quite a few Israeli startups as an active chairman and tapping into this innovation ecosystem. I'm very passionate about music, and luckily I get to combine three of my passions: my family, startup and innovation and music together. And I'm also very passionate about diversity. Cyprus is an island. Israel is not an island, but the fact that we're surrounded by countries that in a large way make us an island. We have our own complicated story, like Cyprus, a little bit different. I'm not going to get into all the politics. I also believe that these conditions actually make us more flexible, stronger, and resilient. So with all the issues that we have, this also could be a way of making us better. I want to go back 100 and something years, and I'll show quite a few slides with 1918 and 2018. This is a picture of my two grandfathers in 1918, which was the end of World War I, and one of them was fighting for the Russian army, for the Tsar, and the other was fighting for the German army, for the Kaiser. Like most Israelis, my parents arrived in Israel as refugees after Hitler came to power in the 1930s. So this is the world 100 years ago, a totally different world than what we have today. And they came to this very small Israel, and I, through the years, hosted thousands of people coming from all over the world to Israel, and I would always explain how small we are, because people know that Israel is small, but only when you see it on the map you realize that we're 1/400th of Brazil or of Australia and 1/17th of Germany. When I look at Cyprus, it's one of the few countries in the world where actually Israel is larger, 2.5 times larger. And of course, we're the closest neighbors beyond the borders we have with the Arab countries. But if you look a little bit different, there are other similarities and differences between Israel and Cyprus. Israel is approaching 10 million people. Cyprus is obviously around 1 million, so it's a big difference in scale. And over the last few years, you can see on the bottom left side how the GDP of Israel has grown from the 20,000 to the 47. So the last 10, 15 years in Israel have really seen a revolution in terms of the economy, the standard of living, the wealth. And Cyprus, by the way, is also growing, and it's not by any means a poor country, but I think what I heard this morning, there is a vision here to grow this dramatically, and it's totally doable. So I think success for Cyprus would be that in 5, 10 years from now, you get on this slope, which gets you to the 40,000, 45,000 GDP per capita. Beyond that, in terms of inflation, unemployment, very similar. Now, what's really changed Israel over the last 15 years is the high-tech sector. And to a large extent, it started with foreign investments, large multinational companies that came and started investing in Israel. And 10 years ago, if you talk to any Israeli, we were very proud that companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, HP, etc., were in Israel, opening up R&D centers and giving a lot of employment and knowledge. And this was a very good start, and there are literally hundreds of them from the United States mostly, but also Europe, Japan, China, etc. But the last 5, 10 years, this has changed dramatically and really transformed the economy in Israel. And today, Israel has a lot of local companies, and the dream is not anymore just to be part of a multinational company as an R&D center, to create something, to sell it, and do R&D for Microsoft. The dream is to set up your own end-to-end company. I call this full stack, and then actually to continue to manage the company from Israel, usually to go public in NASDAQ. Indigo was one of the few companies in Israel that was acquired by HP in 2002 and retained its independence. So we were part of HP, but all the R&D, production, management, strategy, everything was in Israel. We managed from Israel. We exported from Israel. We became $1.5 billion entity inside HP. These companies today are just some of the examples, and it's accelerated dramatically over the last 2-3 years, to some extent because of the COVID. Over the last 2 years in Israel, there are 51 new unicorns established. 51 companies valued at over $1 billion. This is for a country with 9 million people and a relatively small local market. So the success is there, and what I'm starting to see is that if 15, 20 years ago we had a lot of R&D talent, but we didn't know how to grow companies, we didn't know how to manage companies, we really needed to rely on the American corporates. Today in Israel, we're starting to have a situation where you have very good managers that know how to scale companies from 10 million to 100 million to $1 billion. And that is a totally different skill set than starting a startup and just innovating with an amazing idea. And today, you'll see different rankings, but Israel is way up there in terms of startups. It's sometimes called the startup nation. We're definitely, in terms of the number of companies in NASDAQ or high-tech activity or VC activity, in the top 3, 4 in the world. And in Europe, I don't know if UK is part of Europe now, but if you look at Europe, and I consider ourselves part of Europe, we're definitely in a very good place. And I would hope that, given the geographic proximity, the cultural similarity, but also the size, there will be opportunities to cooperate between Israel and Cyprus on many levels, just best practice sharing, people, etc. And the last thing I want to say is that over the last 2 years, the COVID has become an opportunity for numerous reasons, because change always drives opportunity. There's tons of free money in the world today. You can access capital if you have a good story, if you have a good idea, you can access capital. And you can see this hockey stick, which you always see in future slides, and it usually never happens. This is the reality. It's absolutely incredible. Today, the big constraint in Israel is not capital, it's actually people. We're just missing people. We can't hire people for anything. Software engineer, chemists, planning, logistics. It's crazy, and it's a big, big problem. There are many indexes beyond just the economics. And at the end, Israel is doing very well economically. Trust me, we have tons of problems. We have a lot of poverty, we have racism, we have problematic politicians, we have too many problems. And at the end of the day, what you want to do, I think, in a country, but also in a company, is not just succeed financially. You want to create some kind of an index which is more balanced. There's one very nice one which I like. It's called the Happiness Index, which takes into account economic conditions, corruption, generosity, family, etc., etc. Usually the top 10 countries in the world are Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland. Israel, for the last few years, has been always between 10 and 12, which is a pretty nice place. Cyprus is 32, which is very impressive. Israel 10 years ago was also about 32. So again, I encourage you, as citizens of Cyprus, but also as entrepreneurs, don't just measure yourself in terms of success financially. You might be very successful financially even as a country, but it trickles down to 10%. So I really like this index, and we measure it and track it inside the companies I work with in terms of a balanced scorecard and impact way beyond the financials. So I want to go back to my family and to a little bit of context. I'm an amateur historian. I studied history in the University of Jerusalem together with my MBA. And I think the most stunning slide that I ever have shown is the next one. And not because of this beautiful baby on the left side, that's my father, but it's because I'm trying to show here what has happened during the lifetime of my father. My father was born in 1925, and just a few weeks ago he turned 96. And it's a picture of him with my daughter. So he is 96 years old, and over this period, the world population has grown from 2 billion to almost 8 billion. We're actually 7.9 billion people. So in one man's lifetime, 6 billion people have been added to this planet. If you look at the previous history, it took the world tens of thousands of years to get to 1 billion, 100 and something years to get to the next billion. Look what's happening here. It's starting to slow down a bit, and there are many models saying, will we peak at 9 billion or 10 billion, but this planet is very, very, very crowded. This is probably the single biggest impact on all of our lives collectively, because you can't even say today, I live in Cyprus, it's a small island, we're fine, I don't care what's happening elsewhere, because global warming and the price of shipping containers, everything at the end is a result of this population growth. Now, I will say that this population growth has come with an amazing explosion of technology. And if you try to chart the last, 20,000 years of humans, there's been a lot of innovation. There's the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. There was a lot of innovation at the end of the 20th century, electricity, telephone, communication, railroads, etc. But if you really look what's happened in the last 30 years, 10 years, there's an explosion of technology which is incredible. It is really unbelievable. And somebody said here before that they're an optimist and they think technology can solve all our problems. I buy that. It can, but it doesn't mean it will, because we can also destroy our planet or use technology for bad things. But really, this graph, I think, shows the incredible explosion and the opportunity that we have. So we live in a fascinating time, but we also live in a very, very, very dangerous time. Because if you take the combination of 6 billion more people and less people being poor and more people eating meat and using energy and buying clothes, and I'll show some of the numbers later, the impact on our planet is not sustainable. One of the companies I'm a chairman today is developing alternative meat. We call it new meat, based on plants. And the reason is, beyond the economic opportunity, is the fact that today, if you look into the world, the impact of growing cows for meat on the planet is 4.3 gigatons CO2 equivalent, which is 5 times more than the impact of all the air travel around the world. It's crazy. And it's growing because, we live pretty good lives. We take it for granted that we can eat meat. When you go to China, India, Africa, people are just moving to eat more and more meat. So again, there's an opportunity, but the way we live today is not sustainable, and today technology needs to be used to solve some of these big problems. So we're living in a period of change, which for me is an incredible opportunities for entrepreneurs. And again, if you look at Israel, the country was established in 1948 in a very bloody war. In 1918, we were under the British mandate, a bit like Cyprus, very, very poor, very socialist country. In 1968, right after our Six-Day War, we were still very poor, we were still very socialist. Food was rationed. And then fast forward 50 years, Tel Aviv with a high-tech city, the environment, the tourism. Same in communication. The telephone, amazing invention, very expensive, very complicated. 50 years later, in Israel, when I grew up, to get a phone took 4 years. And when you picked up the phone, you had the line with a lot of other people, so you couldn't use it. Today, we take it for granted. Instant communication, very, very easy. Change in energy. 100 years ago, and when the European Union was formed, coal was king, and coal was a good thing, and nobody ever thought of the negative impacts of coal. And then we had nuclear energy, like as the big solution for all our energy problems. And then 10, 15 years ago, people started talking about wind power and sun power. It was very expensive. It didn't make too much economic sense. Today, solar energy is cheaper than coal or nuclear. Still a very small percent of the energy, at least in Israel, but at least it's moving in the right direction. And then talking about things that I'm dealing with today, the textile industry, all of us wear clothes. It all has to be dyed. You start with cotton or polyester, something white. It has to be turned into a color. How was it done? It was done in Cyprus and Israel thousands of years ago with natural dyes. And then a whole industry started with these sweatshops, pollution, horrible. And people realized it doesn't make sense, so there was a lot of investment to make the whole system cleaner, more effective. And in the 60s, you had very nice factories, but still at the end, you take something, you put it into you dye it into a big vessel, you waste a lot of water. If you go to advanced countries, the water is recycled. If you go to countries like India, it's just thrown into the rivers. It makes no sense. So this is an opportunity. One of the companies I work with is called Twine, and in 2008, they invented a machine where you take a piece of thread, you put it on one side, and on the other side you can get, within seconds, any color you want, without using any water, without any waste. And this is an example of an innovation which has a fantastic economic impact, but also changes the world in terms of the environment. And the same goes for meat. If you look at 1918 and 1968, the meat industry is the same meat industry. You grow a cow, you go slaughter it, you eat the various elements. In 2018, a company was formed called Redefine Meat, which makes what we call new meat. We want to change the whole system on its head. We want to produce meat which tastes and smells and has the juiciness of meat, but is 100% plant-based. And if we do that, and even 10-20% of the steaks will move to plant-based, we can have an impact like stopping all air travel around the world. So it's pretty dramatic. So how do these things work? How do these companies in Israel and elsewhere start and actually succeed? And by the way, not all of them succeed. That's fact of life. For me, it starts with a vision. It starts with a dream. It starts with trying to change the world. And I remember when I had my first meeting in 1995 with Benny Landa, who was the founder of Indigo. At that time, the world was just starting to be digital, and he had this very famous statement. He made the cover of Newsweek, and on it, with his picture, there was a sentence saying, "Everything that can become digital will become digital, and printing is no exception." And that was a world dominated by Heidelberg and other German, Japanese companies. 200 years, were doing amazing. Everybody thought it was a joke. What do you need digital? It's slow, it's not very good quality, it's expensive, it doesn't print and everything. This was his vision, and he told me at that interview, "Alon, I want to lead the printing industry in the digital world." And I looked at the guy and I thought, wow, what kind of an arrogant statement. I mean, who are we? We're a tiny startup in Israel. The printing industry is almost $1 trillion industry. We're going to lead this industry. But looking back, I really had the amazing experience of being part of this leadership, because leading is not just being the biggest. Leading is driving the change. Leading is opening up new opportunities. So I think, again, the biggest risk is to set a vision which is relatively humble, and then you meet it. And I'll tell you, working again in a big corporates and big companies find it very hard to take a risk, because your career is dependent on not making mistakes more than changing the world. And startups are all dependent on changing the world. So starting with a vision and taking the risk, for me, is step number one, lesson number one. The other thing is, how do you actually execute the vision? Indigo in Israel sits right next to the Weizmann Institute, which is our top research association. And the guy that was managing this institute for many years, I had the opportunity to meet with him and to talk to him. He has a list of hundreds of PhD people that want to join his organization. And I asked him, how do you choose between all these amazing people that finished MIT and Harvard? They all want to come and work for you. And he said, look, I read their studies and I get references, but at the end, I'm looking for people that are curious, people that are open to questioning. And it's maybe a little bit hard to read this, so I'll read it for you. He said, the best research is carried out by people who have the freedom to ask questions. You're willing to question the current way of doing things. And for him, this is part of the Jewish culture, because we like to argue. There's a statement in Israel, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, which is pretty true. And the second thing he says, Israel is a highly multicultural society, and this provides multiple approaches to solving problems and unique ways of integrating these approaches. For me, this is critical. Israel benefited in the 90s from a huge immigration of almost 1 million Jews from the ex-Soviet Union. Amazing value. We have 20% of the population that's actually Muslim, Arab. We have immigrants from all over the world. Cyprus also has the beneficiary of having great English, strong relationships, and a lot of people from Russia, relationship with the United Kingdom, being part of the European Union. Nurture this. This diversity is fantastic. And then when you have a vision and you hire the right people, there, for me, is a clear element of how do you build a team and how do you motivate people. And this is especially important in times of stress. And the COVID was a great example of this. When everything is going well and your startup is doing well, things are great. The question is what happens when things are tough. And there are few ways of managing. And again, putting on my historic hats, for many, many thousands of years, it was very simple. You had a very small layer of kings, aristocracy, even the church, and you had what's called level -1 relationships. A few people told the others what to do. If you didn't do it, you got in trouble. That was level 1. Over the years, this evolved, of course, and a lot of things happen. And today, I would say in most companies, certainly the big American corporates, you have level 1, rule-based, role-based, professional relationship. There's a process for everything. There's an annual review. You get rewards, you get promotions, you get bonuses. It's very good. It's a good system. To skip to level 3 is very intimate, 100% mutual commitment. For me, it's a family business. Think of a family business, second, third generation, the father, the mother, the children, they all work together. There's no separation between work and personal life. There's full 100% trust. You can fight, you can have disagreements, but it's yours. For me, coming from Indigo, most of our customers were family businesses. So my interaction was with people that didn't buy from Indigo $1 million machine and then gave it to somebody else and 3 years later had a different job. This was their life. And I love this kind of emotional connection. And in Indigo, I always strive to build a culture where there was total mutual commitment. Now, can you build this when it's a company that's owned by certain people and you have investors? It's a little bit more difficult. That's why level 2 for me is very important. Personal, cooperative, trusting relationships. It's not about, I'll do this and I'll get this. In Indigo, we never told people, if you bring a great colleague of yours to work, we'll give you a bonus, an incentive. We said, bring your friends. It'll be good for you, it'll be good for them, it'll be good for us. And then, when people did well, we helped them, and when times were tough and people had tough situations, we helped them as much as we could. So this, for me, is very critical. This is creating the culture of the company, and it's a lot a result of what you do as a founder and your values and how you treat people and what people you hire. The other big lesson that I think I've learned through the years is that you have different kind of problems and you need different people to solve different problems. I'm not going to get into this whole complicated model, but anyone that wants to can go and Google wicked problems and you'll find it out. But basically, this approach says there are 3 kind of problems. There are critical problems. A critical problem is we have a fire, and we call the fire department to put out the fire. There's a defined problem. There are people that know how to solve it. It's urgent. You don't have to think too much. You can think of examples in your business, right? You have a cybersecurity attack. You call the experts. You have tame problems. Tame problems are more complicated, and you really need experts to manage the process to reach the solution for the problem. These are more complicated problems. But probably the most fun problems and the most difficult problems are what are called wicked problems. These are very complicated problems. You actually don't have a simple answer, and you can't reach an answer just by calling in an expert. And this is where leadership comes in. This is where it's difficult to define the problem and the solution. There's actually no one solution. It's very interactive, and this is where leadership and teamwork come in. Most startups are trying to solve wicked problems because the simpler problems have already been solved. So it's very important to have this framework, and to solve a wicked problem, you need the diversity and you need the curiosity, because you're trying to solve something which nobody has solved before, and you don't have one expert that can just do it for you. And again, an extremely important lesson, and I like the minister saying that at the end of this conference he wants to meet and to get the feedback. I think it's great. Anybody who does, and anybody who has a vision which is very lofty, is going to fail all the time. And failing is great. And here's one of the most amazing athletes ever that writes, with all his success, he's missed 9,000 shots, he's lost 300 games. So you learn from it. And by the way, learning from it is a process. It's not just, okay, I'm going to learn. It's at the end of every conference, having a summary and saying, this I could have done better, this I could have done, and it starts with saying what I could have done better. Not, you guys didn't do it well, you guys didn't do it well. So I think that's a very valuable methodology, especially for startups. It's a small group. Every time you do something, you sit back and you learn. And the last message that I want to leave you with is that there's a startup mode, and when you're a startup, you're by definition an insurgent. You're trying to change the world, you're trying to go against very big companies, the banks that have been doing it for many years, the meat companies that have been doing it for many years. You want to grow, and you want to disrupt. The disadvantages of the big companies are usually they're struggling bureaucracies. They're big, they're complicated, they don't want to take risks. Their managers are not very close to the customers, etc., etc. But as you become bigger, and any of you that are already managing companies with 50, 100, 200 employees, you start seeing the forces of gravity slow you down. Things get complicated. You have a lot of opinions. You start being politically correct. In this model, it's called the westerly winds. And all I can tell you, and again, you can Google this, there are some very nice YouTube videos, try to keep the founder's mentality. So as long as you have the founder, it's a little bit easier. But eventually you move on and somebody comes to manage the company, or you just bring in professionals, and you have to have this founder's mentality, which means you're all the time in the front line. You visit customers all the time. Your number one metric is your customer satisfaction. You're all the time close to your people. You all the time experiment. You take risks. You're spiky. You're not always looking at process. You're looking at asking questions that nobody asked before. If you stop doing that, when you succeed, you start sowing the destruction of your own success. So again, it's difficult in a short period to capture too much of my experiences. I really share the vision of a relatively small country that's in a good place and has a lot of fantastic inherent advantages of weather, educated people, safety, family, tradition, etc., and is trying to continue to grow and to attract talent. And I think the combination of having a bold vision, building the right team, creating the right culture, and then trying to define what problem you're trying to solve, how you solve it, and then never becoming too self-confident, too cocky, knowing that success can always end very, very quickly, is a great formula for success. And at the end, for me, it's a lot about teamwork, about building things together, and also having fun while you do it, because life is short, and it's not only about work and business and financial success. So again, I hope I've given you some room for thought. If any of you want additional information on any of these articles or models, or to talk to me after, I understand there's a Q&A session now. I'm here for the next few days and happy to talk to anybody. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Alon, I don't think you're leaving just yet. I'm going to invite someone on stage, Mr. Paul Josephak, and you're going to have a bit of a beachside conversation, or otherwise known as fireside. I've just decided to change it because we're on the beach.
Yep.
So, guys, this is where the Q&A happens, and this is Paul Josephak, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. So we'll take a seat because you've been standing for a while, and I'm happy to be back. For those of you who saw me last year, I was wearing a mask, so I apologize. This time I can actually talk normally. I just wanted to ask you some questions based on what you presented. And let's get a little bit more concrete. So one of the things that I was thinking the whole time, when you were talking about Israel and the success of Israel, and we're here in Cyprus, the politicians were talking about all the kind of things they want to do to make Cyprus successful. What would be 2 or 3 things that you've seen happen in Israel that could happen in Cyprus to make this quasi a destination for technology and innovation?
So, many people connect Israel's success to the army and to the military, and I think it's true just for to a certain extent, on 2 levels. First of all, the fact that when you're 18, you go and spend a few years, in Israel it's 3 years for men and 2 years for women, in the army, changes you and gives you tools and discipline, so that's one thing. And there's no doubt that the military also is very technological, so when you leave the military, some people have a good education. But I think that's just part of it. I think Israel had a combination of diversity, which helped, and it did have very good government programs in the early years, because in the beginning there were no VCs, nobody wanted to invest, so Israel had this system of actually helping startups with some funds. Initially you didn't even have to return it. When it became more successful, you started to return it, but there was a system. So I think government support and creating a transparent system where people can get support, ask questions, that's one that's very, very important. The other is just sort of the culture that it's okay to fail. When you have a culture where failure is terrible, you're probably never going to take the risk. So I think it's the government, it's the universities, it's the entrepreneurs themselves. Try to share your successes, try to help others, and that's again the advantage of small. In Israel, anybody can reach anybody in 1 day and 2 phone calls, and I'm sure it's the same here. If you go to Germany or the United States, it's too big, you can't do it. It's a huge advantage, this smallness and this ability to network very quickly.
Is it also connected to the mindset? So is there a very specific, definable mindset in Israel that you would say doesn't exist elsewhere or could be cultivated elsewhere?
We as Israelis, and again, I don't know enough about Cyprus. First of all, as I showed you, our parents are immigrants. We went through wars. I have a feeling Cyprus, what you guys went through in '74 and everything, it doesn't disappear in 1 generation. So we don't take anything for granted. We're very proud of our country. We could live elsewhere, right? But we choose to stay in Israel and to build something. We're very proud of what we have, and this is the mindset. So it's a combination of not taking things for granted, willing to give back to the community, and at the end, the ability to take risks and to support each other when we fail, because you're going to fail.
There's always been a strong connection between Israel and the U.S., especially if you think about the venture community being very active, funds from the U.S. going to Israel, and Israeli funds even going to the U.S. now.
Right.
Is that a bridge that needs to be built maybe in Cyprus, that they need to attract international funds to be located here?
Absolutely. I'm not sure it's only U.S. because you're Europe, and Europe has a lot of funds. It could be U.S. for sure. There are advantages and disadvantages of the U.S. I love doing business with Europe. There's also a lot of money in Asia. And one other tip I'll give you, people love coming to Israel. I mean, Israel had issues with years of bombs and wars, etc. But when people come to Israel or to Cyprus in October, they love it here. So use it. I mean, conferences like this or startups where you tell people come, and then we'll spend a day on the beach, the food, the weather. People love coming here. It's more fun coming here. I did a lot of business with Boise, Idaho. Trust me, you don't want to be in Boise, Idaho after 8 o'clock at night. There's nothing to do there. So, you have a beautiful country. Promote it. Bring people here.
A little bit of a different question. So you came from the startup world, went into the corporate world. Now I'm presuming you're kind of back out. What made you successful as an ex-founder in a large corporate? Because you spent quite a bit of time at HP. What was the secret to that success?
I'll tell you, people, it's a great question. because most acquisitions fail, and most acquisitions of big corporates in Israel, after a year or two, all the original people are gone. We had this culture, which I think Benny Landa started, where we had this intimate relationship between ourselves and with our customers, and for us it became our life's mission, and we just decided we're not going to give up. I don't know if it's rational or not, but all the management team that I worked with in Indigo, we stayed for 25 years, and now that many have left, we remain friends. So it's a bit of a one-off, but it's also connected to this intimacy and to this culture. We treated it as a family business. We treated it as our business. We didn't care that much about corporate, which has its disadvantages as well, but I think that's what enabled us to not just survive, but to grow the business dramatically.
Which one did you enjoy more? Was it better to be the founder in a small business or part of a larger business?
I wasn't the founder. I was the CFO. Benny Landa was the founder. Look, the startup world is fantastic. It's fun. It's easier in many ways. To be part of a corporate is exhausting. But the scale of building something to $1 billion-something, I guess you get to do that if you're very lucky once in your life. So it's an experience that I wouldn't have given up. But it comes with pain.
You're also involved in a new food type of a startup. Something along those lines is a question. So we're at the tail end, I hope, of COVID. Yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of changes on the back of COVID, especially small regions like Israel or Cyprus. What do you think the effect will be there? Can they take advantage of coming out of the pandemic and somehow positioning themselves? Do you have any thoughts on that?
First of all, I think COVID has opened up the notion that the geography is a little bit less critical, and it goes back and forth in the fashion of the world between working at home and not working at home, in one office and small offices, etc. But I think it's opened up the mind of people that don't take anything for granted, because most corporates don't really want to change. They're quite comfortable. I think also the COVID at the end of people's mind is that, I'm not going to go back how it started and why it started, but this whole food chain, it doesn't make sense. And COVID happened, but the next time it could be because of beef or sheep or whatever. We just can't continue assuming nothing will happen and then living through it. So I think the funding today that's available for alternative meat, that's available for different way of doing textiles, it's available for new energy, is amazing. It's more the question, where does Cyprus position itself? Because you don't want to spread yourself too thin. With all respect to Israel, we're a tiny little country, we get a lot of money, but there are a few industries, for example, digital printing, for example, alternative meat, cybersecurity, where we have a very, very important part of the world. But we're not good at mass production, we're not low cost, so you have to define where you think you can succeed. It's going to be very narrow, and there go relatively deep.
I think Israel right now is in a very comfortable position from specifically the unicorns that you showed. I mean, we were talking about before, it just blew up in the last couple of years. Yeah. Could that also become the downfall, in the sense that there becomes so much competition, you can't hire anyone, or?
Absolutely. Look, first of all, the salaries, when HP acquired us, the salary of an engineer in Israel was about 40% of the United States. Today it's higher, because also the benefits in Israel are more European than American. So the salaries are very high. And while 10% of the people in Israel work in high tech and another 10% are associated, 80% don't. So this gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. And to buy a house in Tel Aviv, you have to be a software engineer at Google or Microsoft. So there are a lot of problems, but these are problems that you have to deal with. It's better than the other problem that you don't have it. The other thing is, I don't see it in Israel, but you can become, I called it once in a very bad moment in front of Americans, I said they were the Indigo people, you're fat and lazy because you've grown too comfortable. There is this, you start being happy with your success. I still don't see that in Israel because we still have a lot of problems, but never become too complacent. So there are a lot of risks, but I think they can be managed. If you have a good culture, there's still a long way. The opportunity now in Israel is to move the 10% to 20% and to get the populations that are not really engaged, like a lot of the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox, to work in software, etc., respecting their culture. Because the very ultra-Orthodox women do not want to work in environments in an office with men and women, so there are a lot of huge R&D centers today where they do programming in their own environments. And they have a lot of babies, so they can take care of the babies, and they can have a lot of maternity leave. So you have to adapt reality to your culture. We shouldn't all become Americans or Germans. No, we should keep our own unique culture, which makes us different, and therefore, I think, better.
Do you think the switch now to hybrid or remote models for businesses worldwide, do you think that's going to lead to better companies, or do you see it as a threat?
I am not a big believer in working from the home. I can tell you all the startups I worked with, even in COVID, people worked all the time from the office. Now it's true, we build machines, you need engineers, people work together. I'm all for flexibility, right? You can do things remotely. I still think fundamentally people want to work together, be together. I do think this has changed the fact that people now realize the world is global. You can do Zoom, you don't have to travel all the time, and it's an advantage just for countries like Israel and Cyprus. I can still tell you, if you're a startup and you can bring people to Cyprus for a week, customers, partners, whatever, it's a huge advantage. Because at the end, we're people, and you want to sit, you want to have dinner on the beach, drink a nice glass of wine, eat some fish, create the memories, build the trust, etc. But all this technology of working remotely, etc., it does level the playing field, and I think it's good for the small countries. This notion, I have to do everything in Germany, the United States, nobody takes that seriously anymore.
I'm going to ask one last question. This is a little bit looking into the future. Let's say 10, 15 years out.
Yeah.
Where are we as a society from an innovation and tech perspective? What's your crystal ball say?
I'm personally extremely worried about global warming, and that we're going to reach a point where it's irreversible. And I see all this growth, but I also see the impact of people eating more meat, buying more fashion, using more energy. So I think we have a relatively short window of opportunity that we have to have this sense of urgency. I think if we solve that, we're in a great shape, because you look at the COVID, what technology has done over these 2 years, it's incredible. You know, inventing new vaccines. There will be a cure. There will be a pill at the end. I'm sure it'll happen. So that'll mean more economy, more people, more eating meat. It's not sustainable. Look what's happening to the shipping industry. It's crazy. It's 10x cost. It's not sustainable. So I really hope that we'll become a little bit more humble, and that also the governments, and this is happening in Israel a bit, the incentives will be not just to innovate in general, but to innovate around parameters and solutions that also are good for society, for the planet, and not just for the rich countries, but for the poor countries. This whole environmental goals, sustainability goals, and pushing that, I think that's critical. Again, I think a country like Cyprus can grasp that as an opportunity. You have, it's fantastic here. The air is clean, it's beautiful. You want to keep it that way. So trying to encourage companies and having the minister say, we'll support more companies that have an impact goal, that can quantify it, and we'll give you tools. And people will come here because we like the culture and the mindset. I think this is part of our opportunity.
So it sounds like you remain optimistic and believe technology can get us there.
I'm in general big optimistic, and yes, I'm a believer in technology.
Great. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.